What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We like magic, and today I'm going back to my budget roots and showing you a deck that's under $50, but it's still a lot of fun to play. And we get to play like a bunch of stuff that you won't see in like any other deck, so I'm pretty excited to bring you Black-Red Unsealing today. I'll be honest with you, I have needed to play Sarkhan's Unsealing since the moment I first saw it. Look how beautiful this card is. So instead of just playing the card, that'd be boring, we're going to build the entire deck around it and play 4 copies. Now, truth be told, yeah, the floor on Unsealing is pretty low, and I hope you see what I did there because I'm a master of wordplay. The floor on Unsealing, yeah, you're welcome for that joke. But in any case, the card does do some cool stuff, like note that these abilities happen whenever you cast a creature that's big enough, meaning that you don't even have to resolve the creature. Even if your opponent counters or whatever, you still get 4 damage to a target at least, which is ridiculous. Now, those of us who have been playing for long time, let's just be kind and put it that way, will remember fondly, usually, a card called Flametongue Kavu, and even those of you who haven't been playing that long have probably at least heard of this card, because us old-timers have a habit of bringing up old stuff incessantly, like, that card was really good, and it was really good back in the day. And, you know, a card like Sarkhan's Unsealing just turns all of our creatures that are big enough into better Flametongue Kavus that can target not only creatures, but players and planeswalkers, and if the creatures are big enough, they can effectively wrath our opponent's entire board. And we've got plenty of creatures at pretty aggressive mana costs that can do both things for this deck. Specifically, we have 12 different ways of triggering the first ability on Sarkhan's Unsealing in this deck, and 7 whole ways, that's a lot, of getting that second ability. So all I'm saying is we have plenty of ways to break the seal in this deck. Just wordplay, you guys. Wordsmith, but that was a bit of a reach, I understand that. But in any case, we've got lots of different creatures in this deck that play super well with Unsealing that you might not see in too many other decks, so let's get to those. Now, the first batch of creatures I want to talk about are the creatures that trigger the second half of Sarkhan's Unsealing, because if we're going to play this card, we need to go big and try to get that second half of text whenever we can. But luckily, we've got plenty of cool creatures in Standard that can do it. Again, at relatively aggressive cost. So let me start this admittedly odd menagerie of creatures with the 4 whole copies of Inferno Hellion, which I will probably never talk about again in like any other deck tag, but it's so perfect for this thing. Now, one thing I like about Inferno Hellion is that you can follow a turn 4 Sarkhan's Unsealing with a turn 5 Hellion without actually having to drop a land, which is actually really great a lot of the time, taking the pressure off from either having to draw a land or having to have that land in your hand in the first place. It's a pretty big deal. And as crap as the card might look, as soon as you wrath your opponent's board for 4 mana and stick a body to the battlefield, you'll feel pretty good about that. Like any reservations you might have about playing this card, straight out the door as soon as you actually land it after a Sarkhan's Unsealing, because it's very likely that your opponent is just going to have all their creatures die and you like 2 or 3 for one them, and then suddenly you have a 7/3 that might only last for 1 combat step, yeah, but it's very likely, considering you just wrath their board, to get in for 7 damage on the next turn, or at least kill another creature that has to block it. And then, if it survives that combat step, it goes back in your deck so you can draw it later and wrath their board again, plus 4 damage to the face. All that, and the ride comes equipped with Trample. So even if they can find a creature to throw in its way during the interim between you playing this and attacking with it, it's still going to trample over for like 3, 4, 5 damage a lot of the time. So again, you're not going to see this thing in too many deck techs here on the channel, but this is the deck for it. It can really make the opponent feel like they're actually in hell. Do you see what I did there, by the way? Inferno Hellion in hell. I am really on fire with the puns today, which that one should count as well. Get it? Because on fire and Inferno, I'm almost done with these guys, I promise. But in any case, let's get on to the next creature that can trigger that second half of Unsealing, and that's the couple of copies of Yargle that we're playing. And I know the name kind of sounds like a synonym for throwing up, but that's exactly what your opponent's going to do when you follow an Unsealing with a Yargle. They're going to be like, blah, 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 my creature's in my face as well. So Yargle, again, you're not going to see it in too many things, but this is the deck for it. Being able to just, you know, again, it's on curve with Unsealing. 4 mana Unsealing, 5 mana Yargle. They follow really, really well, and even if your opponent has a removal spell for it, which they very likely will, this thing only has 3 toughness, you know, they can abrade it and kill it, but you'll still have gotten all the value you ever needed out of it. And by the way, if it does get a swing in, like if it wraths their board completely, and then like they can't find a creature to throw in its way to block or whatever, or they don't have the removal spell, if it actually connects, that's 9 to the face, and Yargle will occasionally connect, again, especially when you've just blown all their creatures off the board. So, again, they can't find an answer for it in that one-turn interim. It's entirely possible they'll end up taking at least 13 damage from a Yargle, 9 damage from the attack step, plus 4 damage to their face from the Unsealing trigger. So, Yargle is actually pretty sweet in this deck, and we'll play at least a couple of copies, but no more because it's still Yargle. I'm also going to make room here for just one copy of Torgar, Famine Incarnate. We've got a couple of creatures at the lower end of the curve, and at least one of them synergizes with this, so we can pull off getting this into play for relatively cheap a lot of the time, in which case it does a few different things for us. Obviously, it'll trigger the full Monty on Sarkhan's Unsealing, bust their board open, hit their Planeswalkers, hit them for 4, all that stuff, so it really doesn't have to do too much more than that, honestly. But the good thing is that it does a lot more than just that, Either it'll put them at 10 if they're not already down to 14 by the time you actually cast this, or it'll bring you back up to 10, which is really important in the late game, especially against aggro decks that have gotten you down to like 4 or 6 by the time you can actually set up and get your plan going. Well, Torgar can come down, put you right back up at 10, wrap their board, and hit them in the face for 4 and kill any Chandras that they might have out. So it's definitely worth losing a couple of creatures in that situation to cast this quicker. By the way, if you can't tell, I'm just really stoked about this deck. I just haven't gotten to do a really good, fun budget deck in a while, and that's sort of like the whole reason the channel exists, so I'm glad to be back, you guys. But in any case, I do have another sort of fun of in this deck, and I don't want to overload on one silver bullet copies of stuff, but I do at least want one copy of the Scorpion God in this deck. Now, Sarkhan's Unsealing really put some zing in this guy's sting, I've always felt like Scorpion God was criminally underplayed. This is just a pretty solid card all around, and it's especially good in this deck where not only does it trigger the first half of Unsealing, but it's also a sweet mana sink, which we need. We don't really have a lot of that in this deck, so we need a way to spend our mana if we can't otherwise, and this is a great way to do it. Remove guys, draw cards incrementally, all that's sweet. And if it happens to go to the graveyard, pops right back to our hands, so we get another Unsealing trigger on it. So yeah, I definitely want to make room for at least one copy of this thing. Oh, and by the way, before I move on, just gem piece of tech here. You can always sacrifice your Scorpion God to help cast your Torgar for cheaper, and then Scorpion God will pop back to your hand. You get another trigger on Sarkhan's Unsealing the next turn. So that can be brutal. But you may have noticed, I would imagine by now, that most of the cards I've shown you so far are cards that don't see play, anywhere. They're not really known for being standard powerhouses or anything. So I want a little bit of power, just in case we don't get an Unsealing. I want a creature that's good without Unsealing on the board. So I'm going to call in reinforcements and play 3 copies of Glorybringer here. And at first, I was thinking play Demanding Dragon in this slot, because it must be cheaper, right? But no. It turns out that Demanding Dragon is holding its value because it's new, it's not going to rotate, and Glorybringer's on the way down because it's going to rotate in 2 months. But we can still play it, and it's dropped to $1.25 now, so we really should. We really should. This is just one of the best cards in Standard, objectively, I think, period. So again, it's good even if we don't have an Unsealing on the board. But if we can follow Unsealing with the Glorybringer, then we get to shoot something whenever we cast the Glorybringer. Then we get to swing with a 4/4 Haste Flyer and possibly kill something else when we actually attack with it. So it's just, that sequence is unfreaking believable. Glorybringer was good enough and is good enough without Unsealing, but with Unsealing on the battlefield, it's really stupid. So let's play at least 3 copies of Glorybringer to bring some power into the mix here. But let's get away from these 4 and 5 drop guys, because the deck can't be that top heavy. We obviously have to play 2s and 3s in this deck. But it turns out, good news for us, is that we've got a bunch of creatures at the 3 drop slot that trigger that first half of Unsealing. Pretty sweet. So we'll start with 4 copies of Amit Eternal here. This is another card that's just always kind of been good, and it's going to rotate soon, and that sucks because it never got the play that it really deserved to get, and this might be the last time I get to talk about it, and I'm going to tear up, because this card has always been fine by me, 3 mana 5/5, the Afflict tacked on is nice, but the best thing about this period is that it triggers Sarkhan's Unsealing and hits something for 4 damage when we cast it, and that's all we needed to do, but as soon as it hits the board, it's a stocky body the opponent does have to worry about. But sticking here in the 3-drop slot, we're also going to make room for 4 whole copies of Lathnu Hellion, because we're basically playing Hellion Tribal here. But this is another card, like, it's always been good. It's always been fine by me, you know, 3 mana, 4/4 is pretty good stats, and it always creates some kind of value for you when it enters the battlefield. You know, you get a couple of energy, even if you're not going to use it for the Hellion, or if your opponent removes it and leaves energy behind. You can use that to power your Ether Hub, or another card that we're using that uses energy. We'll get to it in a second. So, you know, just there's a lot of good about this card. It's a pretty stocky body for a low cost, triggers the first half of Sarkhan's Unsealing, which is really all we're looking for in a 3-drop, but I think this does it better than a lot of other 3-drops, because just like Eternal, once it's on the board, it's a really fat body the opponent has to deal with that blocks well or attacks really aggressively, because again, it doesn't cost that much to cast this thing. Let's move down to the 2-drops here, and there's actually a ton of stuff you can do at the 2-drop slot in this deck, but what I ended up on was 4 copies of Glintsleeve Siphoner and 4 copies of Scrapheap Scrounger. Now again, tons of stuff you can do here, including things like Doom Dissenter, which will have a little bit more synergy with Torgar, but you could also play Graveyard Marshal. There are a ton. Just a metric ton of options you could play at the 2-drop slot here. We need 2-drop creatures though. We have to get on the board. We have to interact, whether it's blocking the opponent's creatures or just presenting threats against control decks that they have to deal with. Glintsleeve Siphoner and Scrapheap are both especially good for that last thing. These pressure control decks, Scrapheap keeps coming back after it gets removed. That's always been good against them. And Scrapheap has a little bit of synergy with Torgar. So I like that. That's always good. But Glintsleeve Siphoner also punishing against control decks, where it's going to end up getting us a couple of extra cards over the course of the first few turns if they can't control it. But we'll finish off the main deck here with the full 4 copies of Abrade. You know, again, I want to have options in the early game. We can't be super top heavy here, and I'd like to be able to control the board early if we possibly can, especially against Heart of Kiran. That's a card we absolutely hate seeing. We're still trying to get set up by the time they're crewing this and hitting us for 4, like every turn. Like a Heart of Kiran can seriously do like 8 damage to us before we've really done anything involving our, you know, eventual game plan. So we've got to be able to take out Heart of Kiran. We hate the card so much, and for that reason, I'm playing all 4 Braids instead of a similar card like Lightning Strike or even Harness Lightning, which would go with the energy theme. I think it's much more important that we play a card that nails down Heart of Kiran every single time. So I think a Braid is very important here. And here's the mana base right here. We're playing 25 lands in the deck because the curve is pretty high, if you hadn't noticed. And we're not playing, by the way, you may also notice this, Canyon Slough. And yeah, it is pronounced Slough. Pull out your dictionaries. Challenge me, if you will. I see you commenting. But we're not playing Canyon Slough. We're playing Cinder Barons instead. If you have the extra money or you already have the Canyon Sloughs, just play those instead. They're better. But I feel like since we're trying to keep it budget here, Cinder Barons isn't that much different than Slough. So we'll play that. We'll play all 4 Ether Hubs, and we'll even play a Memorial to Folly, which, if you draw it in the late game and you got an Unsealing out, can be really helpful when the next turn comes around and you draw the Yargle that was previously in your graveyard. But here's the sideboard right here, and there's Kitesail Freebooter. You may have been thinking about this card for the main deck earlier, and I honestly am still thinking about this card for the main deck. Could definitely go in instead of Glintsleeve Siphoner, but I really like this card to come in against control decks. Obviously, you know, this can take out counterspells that would ruin our entire day if not for a card like this. You could also play Duress, but I really like having a body for that kind of thing in this deck specifically. So I'll leave it up to you. Duress, Kitesail, but I like Kitesail just a little bit more for the purposes of this deck. And you'll note actually how much of our sideboard plan is against control. Like, yeah, you see the Magma Sprays in there. That's so we have a cheap way to remove creatures in the early game, especially Scrapheap Scroungers, which would otherwise pester us. But mostly, we're trying to take out control here because that's a fairly bad matchup. We go way over the top of most aggro decks, especially if we get enough space to execute our plan. We are just going to blow most aggro decks away. So we've got to focus a lot of our efforts in the board here on control, but we do that pretty well. Not only do we have the freebooters, I already talked about those, but we've also got Argel's Bloodfast to help us draw cards. And note that if we get in trouble, we can always flip it over and then sacrifice any of our enormo dudes and gain a bunch of life. So that can be important, but mostly we don't care about our life total against control, for the most part. So we can just draw a few extra cards a game off of Argel's. That can make a huge difference. We've also got Doomfall in there. This isn't just against control, but it is pretty effective against control, where this gets counter spells out of their hand, but also removal that we don't want them to have, and just huge things. You know, we don't want them to have that Teferi, for instance. We don't want them to have that Torrential Gearhulk. You know, get that garbage out of your hand. So that can be really, really nice. And as an element of Doomfall we definitely need against control, but it can also take out things like Rekindling Phoenix that are really, really, really good against us, just from their hand, or make them sacrifice it. Same thing with Hazaret, Ronus. You know, these are things we don't have a whole lot of answers for, and Doomfall is really good against them, either proactively or reactively. The same thing is true of Hour of Glory. This is great against Ronus and Hazaret and Rekindling Phoenix. We will sight it in against those threats. But finally, you see the Eldest Reborn there. This card is just huge and is actually showing up in a lot of, I won't say a lot, but some main decks nowadays, because it's just a ridiculous bomb that ends up winning you the game if you actually get all 3 chapters on it. But even if you only get the first chapter on it, you at least made them get rid of something. It was 1-for-1 removal in that case. Plus, in this deck, if you've been able to hit off of Sarkhan's Unsealing a couple of times and remove all of the other important creatures from the board, usually this will take out their last thing you couldn't otherwise kill with an Unsealing trigger. So that can be important, but it also makes them discard a card against control, and eventually you'll get one of your guys back, or maybe even a Torrential Gearhulk you've managed to kill. But here are your power rankings for the deck. A final score of 61, which is not bad for a deck that's under $50 right now. You know, you could do a lot worse with a deck that's in this price range. Usually they're sub 60, but 61's not bad. And do note the impressive both offense and defense scores. High scores in those 2 categories usually lead to a pretty decent deck. You know, obviously our defense is good because not only do we have a Braid, Scorpion God and stuff, Glorybringer, yeah, but we've also got Unsealing, which turns pretty much all of our creatures, save for our 2-drops, into removal spells. So defense is nuts, but I'm not going to pretend like the deck just functions perfectly without Unsealing on the battlefield. If there's one weakness to this deck, it's the fact that it really needs Unsealing right there on the board to do any really good stuff. You know, like all the fun stuff the deck really, really wants to do and is designed to do requires that you have an Unsealing on the battlefield, which can be a headache given that there's Thrashing Brontodons and Reclamation Sages and Naturalizes cast out, Ixalan's Binding, blah, blah. There's a ton, especially after sideboards, there's a ton of enchantment hate in this format. So you do have to be careful about that, but while Unsealing's on the battlefield and you're rocking and rolling, you really couldn't be having a better time than you are having playing this deck. I promise. This deck is just unbelievable, and when you actually do go Unsealing into Yargle, it is the best feeling in Magic. But even with its weaknesses, there just really aren't a whole lot of decks at this low of a budget that play at this high of a level, you know? Yeah, there's some crap in here. Your opponent's going to be like, what is this garbage? But there's also plenty of strong cards in the deck, especially lower on the curve. Plus we got Glorybringer, and once Unsealing's in play, all of our cards turn into like the best creatures in Standard. So seriously, the deck is unbelievable once it's got its pieces in play. So give this thing a shot if you possibly can. Most of the deck's not going to cost that much to put together. And if you are interested in giving this thing a shot, just click the very first link in the description box below me, hit show more, and you get a bunch of links. The first one, actually there's only 2 links, but the first one is to TCG Player. They help sponsor my content, they're good folks, and the reason I accepted them as my sponsor is because they're the cheapest place you can get Magic cards. I wasn't going to accept sponsorship to some super expensive garbage place on the internet, so they're the whole reason. A lot of people came knocking before TCG Player. The whole reason I accepted them is because I know for a fact, because I've been using them forever, they have the lowest prices on the internet, and you don't want to overpay even for a budget deck. So click that first link in the description if you're interested in playing this monster. And I hope you are, because like end of the day, I have not had this much fun with a budget deck in a really long time. So give this thing a try if you possibly can. Take it up to F&M and surprise people. It's always a fun thing to do. But in any case, I'm pretty sure I'm tapped out for this one. Let me know how you felt about it down there in the comment section, because there are a ton of different directions you can go with this deck. Like there are a bunch of creatures in Amonkhet block that are really big when you cast them, and then they put -1/-1 counters on stuff. They all work really well with Unsealing too. There's a lot of directions you can go with this. So let me know how you feel about it down there in the comments section, and do all the YouTube stuff on your way out. Hit the thumbs up. It helps me out a lot. Subscribe if you haven't done it yet. Trying to get to 100K. I know we can. So help me out. Ring the bell for the notifications if you would, please. And also, follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev. And if you really enjoy the content, consider throwing me $1 a month on Patreon. All I ask, $1 if you can swing it every 30 days. And I'll let you know what decks we're doing next, and I'll let you vote on what decks to do in the season in the first place. So I try to give you a lot for $1. It's just $1. If you can handle it, throw it in the pot. I'll really appreciate it. But yeah, pretty sure I'm done in earnest for this one. So I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. And as mean as this deck is, remember to spread love and be kind.